We are joined now by Bloomberg News White House correspondent Skylar Woodhouse and by Bloomberg News Middle East correspondent Abeer Omar. Abeer, let me start with you and pick up on the metaphor there used by the vice president that we're in the middle of this game. Get us up to speed on what's happened here recently. We have an attack in Saudi Arabia on Saudi Aramco's Jazan oil refinery. Abu Dhabi's national oil company saying missiles targeted one of its vessels while transiting Hormuz on Saturday. It has been another busy weekend, providing the backdrop to this conversation about a potential conversation here between the U.S. and Iran.
Yeah, good morning, guys. A busy week. As a matter of fact, we've been reporting on this deal between Oman and Iran that was taking place, or the discussions about this deal to essentially reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But a few caveats to bear in mind here. From the Iranian side, they say that this reopening is temporary. They also added their own caveats saying that in this temporary agreement, they're not going to allow U.S. and Israeli flagged ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and they will start charging tolls to countries that they deem hostile. And so a lot of traders had viewed that term hostile as referring to countries from the GCC. And then over the weekend, as you mentioned, David, we saw an ADNOC flagged carrier, that is the national oil company in Abu Dhabi, being hit. ADNOC reported that one fatality had happened and over a dozen injuries there. And then we also saw that the Houthis in Saudi Arabia earlier had claimed that they attacked an Aramco facility in Jizan. Aramco did not respond to Bloomberg requests for comment, but they did confirm that there was a fire at an Aramco facility. So you're seeing this escalation in the region over and over, really, and then no resolution in sight. And this deal that we've been talking about the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, or the interim reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, that really is all what it's about right now. We're not talking about a return to the MOU. We're not talking about a return to those major concessions that were reached in Switzerland. Some hardliners in Iran, to be sure, are saying that the U.S. needs to compensate Iran. And then we saw a return to those concessions, including the blocked assets, the frozen, the oil sanctions as well being lifted. But that is not the official line that we're getting from the diplomats or the officials in Iran that we've been hearing from since the beginning of this war. That includes the foreign minister, that includes the spokesperson for the foreign ministry. And so it looks like it calms down a little bit and then escalates again. But one thing is for sure here, I was listening to Vice President J.D. Vance speaking. Iran maintains that Washington is not a part of those discussions, despite what we've heard from President Trump and the vice president about them being part of those discussions. Iran maintains that mediators, assumingly Qatar at this point, are the ones that are delivering messages. We also understand that Qatar is doing its own draft to start mediating to have those wider discussions. But for the time being, Hormuz stays paralyzed pretty much. Attacks continue to happen, and we don't have a formalized draft between Iran and Oman about that deal.
Skylar, I want to ask you about exactly that. It seems like the U.S. is saying they're monitoring talks, and you're getting that messaging from the White House. But folks I've talked to and the reporting says they don't seem to be in the room. Is the U.S. involved? It seems at this point it's pretty much a bilateral discussion, between Iran and Oman. And also some of these lists of demands that you heard Abeer going through, a list of the U.S. naval blockade, withdrawal of the U.S. military, reparations, release of frozen Iranian assets, those seem like non-starters for the U.S. What does the White House do with all this?
Yeah, good morning, guys. I mean, look, these talks are extremely fragile. And since this war started, that is exactly what we've seen. There's just been a continuing of being up and down. Obviously, the president wants to make it appear that things are going well, that talks are going well, or that things are potentially moving along, as there are a lot of rough patches happening right now. What we've seen in reporting and Bloomberg's own reporting as well is that, the president feels a bit boxed in right now and is really sort of trying to navigate what his next step is. And as he listens to his advisors, whether that's Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Vice President J.D. Vance, or Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, it's really raising questions as to what is the goal right now, especially as it seems that these conversations are really not going well, especially as we, learn and as Iran, says that the U.S. is sort of not really involved right now. And it's raising questions on, well, who is the U.S. Really talking to right now in this war? Yeah.
I want to play a bit more sound here of the vice president in conversation with Kayleigh McEnany, the former press secretary, now on Fox News, talking about the White House's expectations. Let's take a listen.
The Iranians, through different methods, have broadcasted that they look to tighten their grip on the Strait of Hormuz. So in a theoretical deal, what would an acceptable status quo be for the Strait?
Well, our expectation is you're going to see the same amount of oil and gas come out of the Gulf that you saw before the conflict started. That is what the Iranians have told us that they are going to do. That's what the entire Gulf coalition wants to do as well. But, you know, we don't trust, we verify. We actually look not at people's words, but at people's deeds. You see some people within the Iranian system, of course, talk about tolling. The Iranians have told us they have no plans to toll the Strait of Hormuz. But again, we're going to see what actions actually happen.
Abeer, on that notion of looking at people's words and trusting but verifying, you mentioned the Iranian foreign minister, and Bloomberg has reported that he said that were there to be some sort of agreement, we would not see kind of an instantaneous return to the level of energy passing through that strait that we saw before this war began. Could you talk a bit more about that, kind of the White House's expectations for normality, which seem increasingly kind of pie in the sky in light of what we've been through here over the last 5 or 6 months?
Yeah, you're right, David. And I mean, you don't have to go by the words of, and I know this will probably sound surprising, but you don't have to go by the words of either part of the warring parties. Essentially, traders don't even assume that this is going to be happening or that this is even a realistic situation purely due to the physicality of getting those stuck oil barrels that are in the Strait of Hormuz. So there's a reality situation here to be confronted once this happens. And then we're not even talking about a full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. From the Iranian side, the U.S. side seems more and more optimistic about once a deal is finalized or once a deal is here, that we're going to see the Strait of Hormuz immediately all of a sudden open and all these oil barrels start making their way through the globe. You're talking about countries in the region who've had their infrastructure damaged. You're talking about attacks on energy infrastructure that is still happening up until the early hours of the morning. And so there's the physical aspect of actually getting those oil barrels across. I was talking to a lot of ship owners and a lot of traders over the past week, and they confirmed that even if there was an immediate reopening of Hormuz, let's say tomorrow, theoretically, of course, it'll take weeks in a best case scenario, if not months, to actually start seeing a normal trickle of oil barrels through the Strait of Hormuz. And that is not a base case scenario, David, right? Because we expect that this conflict will be back and forth for a while to come, especially with Iran's waking up to this fact at the start of this war that it can assert dominance over the Strait of Hormuz. And it doesn't have to hit hard, right? The mere threat of Iran sending a drone to a ship or a vessel that is passing through the Strait of Hormuz is already causing enough jitters in the market and causing ships to really stay still until they're sure they can move across the waterway. And so we're not even expecting the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz because this is, according to the Iranian side, not what is going to happen.
Skylar, in that vein, it's been interesting to watch the messaging from the White House from the beginning of the war, which is we're going to win, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, to trying to almost redefine what a win looks like. And in that vein, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, talked to a local Arizona journalist and was saying, among other things, well, the Strait of Hormuz is going to become irrelevant in 2 years because we'll have other ways to transport this energy. Overall, is that what you're seeing from the White House, is more of a recognition as they can't move the needle as much as they want to, so they're moving the messaging? And do you think that's going to be successful, especially ahead of the midterms, where things like gas prices are really going to matter, and they're really going to matter to this president?
Yeah, well, look, they want to paint a pretty picture, and they want it to seem like they're in control of everything and that things are going well in their favor as they launch this war, especially as the November midterms creep up. And, you know, American voters have not really, polls have shown that they are not highly supportive of what the president decided to do in regards to the war with Iran. So look, what we've seen throughout the messaging from the Trump administration, really since the president returned back to office, is that, you know, they are seeking other ways. So, you know, when trade deals were being disrupted left and right, the messaging was that, you know, we're starting new trade deals with other countries, or we're going to have trade deals coming in other ways to offset those long-standing trade deals that were disrupted. So we've seen that sort of messaging before, that they pivot to something else to really amplify and to cover, you know, what is currently going on. And really only time will tell to see how that really resonates with voters, especially as these these midterms near.
Abeer, when we talk about opening the strait, there were some reports this week that Iran might be speaking to or might be willing to speak to the EU to come up with some sort of mine clearing capacity. If you remember, we've talked about before, the U.S. kind of outsourced that capacity to NATO about 10 years ago. So most of those minesweepers are within the NATO realm, within the Europeans. Have you heard anything more? Does that seem realistic? And what is the status of those mines? Is that something that's really front of mind for all these shippers and people you were just talking to?
100%. I mean, that is one of their biggest concerns, right? Because there is the aspect of trying to move their way through the Strait of Hormuz without having the risk of being hit. But then there's also the risk of mining. And we've recently reported that Iran might be softening its stance when it comes to involving EU nations. If you remember, Christina, about a month or so ago, there was this little back and forth between Iranian officials and President Macron, specifically in France, who said that France would be one of the countries that is willing to come and mine. And the response from the Iranian side was vehement refusal to this. But we've reported, citing our own sources recently, about a week or so ago, that Iran might be holding discussions with EU nations to help the demining processes in the Strait of Hormuz. And while that is a positive signal, of course, the fact that Iran might be softening its stance, we're still talking about a deal between itself and Oman without Washington involved, having with Washington or the United States still having its naval blockade in place. So a third party that is important in all of this is not included in the discussions, again, according to the Iranian side. So we have to get over the hurdle of getting through these negotiations with Oman and what exactly the mechanism will look like before we get into any kind of discussion about removing those mines. Iran is keeping a really hard line about its dominance over the Strait of Hormuz, and the mechanism sounds really complicated, but everything around it just suggests that Iran wants to maintain its dominance. And it looks like for the people who have skin in the game, for the ship owners who have to make their way through the Strait of Hormuz, they are seemingly tilting more to listening to the Iranian side. They've been seeking permission from the Iranian side to be able to make their way through the very crucial waterway, which, yes, according to the U.S., U.S. officials, is not going to be crucial in the next couple of years.
Okay.
That argument, according to many people, is not the base case scenario. Again, it might lose significance, but it will not be insignificant.